Good evening, my little princesses. Are you ready for bed? Are you ready for a bedtime story? So, once upon a time, there was a princess called Shirley, and she was trapped on an island. But not trapped like trapped in a trap, or trapped under something, or trapped inside a house, or trapped in a car. She was trapped on an island, which means she was free to go anywhere on the island, and she could try and swim away if she wanted to escape. But, of course, she couldn't because she didn't know how far she had to swim, and she didn't have a boat or any way to get off the island. So we'd say she was trapped on the island. However, it's not all as it seems. It's not so terrible after all, because do you remember when they had finished a long meal and they'd had a nice few days and they'd just finished shaving the sheep and they had all this wool ready for if it became cold? And so, as I said before, they were starting to enjoy living on the island, and they were living very nice. They had lots of food that they'd got from the boxes off the ship. They got lots of fresh fruit and vegetables that they were picking around the jungle. They always remembered not to go down the hill into the jungle because of the scary wild pigs. But they were quite happy with what they've got. They never went hungry, and they always had something nice to eat. The bird, the parrot, Mr. Master, sometimes would find really exotic fruit from far away on the island. Of course, this is somewhere that Shirley couldn't go, because he sometimes found a really magical fruit on top of the mountain that was in the island, right at the top of the tree. The sheep couldn't even dream of getting the fruit from there, so that's another reason why Shirley really loved Master, because he could go to places that nobody else could, and he could fly and see everything from above. And Shirley, well, she could go into the beach and into the sea and swim down and see everything from there. And I guess the sheep could walk around and push a few things and make some grass flat, so he was quite happy anyway. And now that he'd been shaved and was lighter and cleaner than before, he could run around faster and everything. He was quite liked it. And so, they were living very happily on this island. And time passed, and day by day they passed. And then one day, as they were eating their breakfast, the sheep looked up, and it was a very crystal clear blue sky and beautiful sunny morning with a slight breeze and very clean air. The sheep spotted what he thought was a ship. It was ever so tiny little prick, far out to sea. He had to blink a few times because he wasn't sure, and he rubbed his eyes and was like, "Hey, guys, is that a ship?" Well, they both turned around, Shirley and Parrot, and Shirley rubbed her eyes too and had to look quite a while. "I think it is a ship." Master immediately flew up into the sky, and he tried to fly just a bit closer and a bit higher so he could see. Sure enough, it was a ship, and the ship had white sails, so we knew it wasn't a pirate ship. It was coming along the side of the island, which had the fire on it. Do you remember? On one side was the big help, and on the other side was the dried wood and all the things ready for the fire. It was really far out, but the three of them immediately left the breakfast, ran to the other side of the island, and started to light the fire. They tried to light it, but it wouldn't work, and so Shirley had to run back to the other boxes and try and find a lighter or something. She did, and by the time she got back, the Master and the sheep were waiting for her to start the fire. She lit one of the pieces of dry grass and it was in flames in a second, and all the wood was burning, and they had to jump back because it was so hot. They had to walk back a little bit, and they stood up on the hill just before going into the jungle and watched as the flames grew higher and higher, and the smoke went white. And then Parrot had an idea. Why don't we put a little bit of green grass on it, and it'll make the smoke all black, and maybe the ship can see us then. And so that's what they did very quickly. They went and gathered all the low-lying branches from the trees and all the bits of grass that they could, and they threw it on the fire. And just as Parrot had said, the smoke turned darker and darker and darker. And they knew then that if there was a chance that they could be rescued, it surely was this. And if there was a chance that somebody on that ship far, far out to sea was going to just turn their body and look in this direction, I'm sure that they would be able to see the smoke and then come and collect and rescue Shirley, Princess Shirley, whose mommy and daddy had disappeared and probably drowned, whose home, the castle, was probably burnt to the ground, who didn't have a country to go to anymore, and whose uncle was waiting for her. But she was trapped on an island. The three of them stood there, fixed with their eyes on this ship, the tiny little dots on the horizon, and they were looking at it for so long and with so much intensity that their eyes started to hurt, and the ship started to blur in their eyes, and they couldn't focus anymore, and the sun got brighter and brighter, and it just got impossible for all of them to keep looking at the ship all this time. They knew that the ship was so far away that even moving a little millimeter on the horizon was going to take a few minutes, and for the ship to move a little centimeter or two on the horizon was going to take about an hour. So they decided just to take a little bit of a rest and to make sure that the fire was still burning and that the smoke was still bellowing from the fire. And that's what they did. They took turns. First of all, Master Parrot would keep look at the ship to make sure that it wasn't going away, and the other two, Shirley and the sheep, would get the grass and the wood to keep the fire going. And then they'd both run up the hill, and then Parrot and sheep would go and gather the grass and the wood, and they would come up the hill, and then Shirley and the parrot, and so on and so forth, until they would keep taking turns and keep looking. And they had quite a good system going on, and they did this for about 5 hours. Would you believe it? It took them all the way until after lunch. They did not have any thought of eating any lunch, because how could they? How could they give up this chance to be rescued to have some lunch? They could have lunch whenever they wanted. They were not going to give up on this. And they knew that if they kept the fire going, and if one of the people on that ship turned around and saw, then they would be rescued. But if they went back and had their lunch because they felt either hungry or that it's lunchtime, then they knew for 100% that the fire would probably go out, that the smoke would probably stop, and that any chance of anyone on any ship turning around to see any smoke to rescue any little princess, well, that would just be zero. And so it was an easy decision not to have lunch at lunchtime and to focus on being rescued. And so they kept it up for another 2 hours, and then another 3 hours, and then, as they had secretly been dreading, and they knew deep down that this moment would come if the ship didn't spot them, it started to get dark. And now this presented an even bigger problem, but an even bigger opportunity, because of course in the daylight it's hard to see the fire and it's easy to see the smoke, But at night time, it's very hard to see black smoke in a black sky, but it's very, very easy to see a shining, strong flame in the black sky. And so they put more and more wood on it. They didn't really care about the smoke anymore. They wanted to make the flames and fire as big as possible. And they got all the dry wood that they'd collected in the hopes that somebody on that ship would turn around and spot the fire. They were starting to get very, very hungry now, and it was in the evening, and it should have been dinner time, and it should have been lunchtime. And they'd left the breakfast on the beach to go and start the fire in the morning. So they had not had any food at all, and they'd been working non-stop up and down the beach, getting the wood and the fire ready, and then looking with such intensity that their eyes would hurt. And then they'd go and build the fire again, and if the wind blew the smoke into their face, their eyes would sting, and all three of them now had very, very red eyes. They had very, very aching arms and legs and muscles and scratches and cuts. And on top of this, they were all very, very hungry. And slowly, bit by bit, they began to lose hope. They began to give up. They began to slow down. And eventually, the ship that was a tiny, tiny dot on the horizon in the sea slowly disappeared. And then it was dark, and they didn't know what to do. Should they continue to build the fire in the dark? Should they give up and go and get some food? What should they do? Well, it was well into the midnight now, and I think it was Shirley that said that they should stop, because she thought they'd been doing it now for more than 12 hours. And if the person on the ship had not seen them in the 12 hours, then the chances that they would just turn around now and have a look when it's so dark, when they're probably all asleep, when we should be asleep, the chances of that are probably pretty low, like zero. And so she thought, why don't we just save the rest of the wood to the next time? Save the rest of the grass and the greeneries until next time. Let's save ourselves and our bodies for next time, because if we keep going and if we keep working as hard as this in the middle of the night with no breakfast and no lunch and no dinner, what state are we going to be in tomorrow if another ship is on the horizon? And so the parrots and the sheep agreed, and in the dark, with no lights except the flickering of the old fire burning down, they went to get their breakfast off the other side of the beach, and they brought it back with some nice hot coffee and some food from the boxes. And they sat there around the fire, almost like a campfire, as it slowly faded away. The flames got lower and lower, and the heat got lower and lower, until they'd finished their dinner and they'd finished their coffee, and the fire went out. It was pitch black now, and Shirley, the princess, Master the parrot, and Polly the sheep walked back to their house that they'd made, had a wash because they were black as soot. Their face was black because of the smoke. Their hands and feet were filthy because of ratching around for the wood. And they were cut and scratched. And so they cleaned themselves up, and they brushed their teeth, and they got ready for bed. And they went to sleep. And they all needed a very good night's sleep because they were tired. And they were not only tired because they'd worked so hard. They were tired because they'd hoped so hard. They'd hoped so much. They'd wanted to be rescued. And they'd stared and they'd focused and they'd looked at the ship for so long. And they'd imagined somebody, just somebody, even a little boy or a little girl or somebody on the ship. They hoped that they would just turn around and see them, or see the smoke, or see the fire, and come and rescue them. But they didn't. And so not only were they tired, but they were hopeless. Although saying that, they were full, and they'd had a day of working hard to do the best they could. They knew that they couldn't do any more. They knew that they couldn't have made the fire bigger or louder or smoke darker. They knew that they couldn't have worked better as a team. And they knew they couldn't have kept going and going and going, because that's sometimes impossible. And so even though they were still on the island, they knew that they still had a home. They still had food. And they still had each other. And because of this, they still had hope. And so they went to sleep, slightly unhappy, but hopeful that they could do something the next time. The next day was just the same as the day before, except there were no ships. And they made a note to themselves, and they made a promise that every morning when they woke up, they would check on each side of the island to see if there was a ship. And that made them more hopeful. And then they went back to where the fire had been to start to build another one to get ready for the next time. And they were amazed, because where the fire had been, when they cleaned away the sand, the heat from the fire had made a huge, beautiful, sparkling diamond. The fire had melted the sand into the most beautiful diamond you'd ever seen. And so they picked it out and cleaned it up and put it in their living room as a reminder that even though some things get fiery hot and burn down, it's not the end of the world, and there's still hope. And sometimes, under all that dirt and burnt things away, you can clean away to find a shiny diamond. The end